In the last 6 months, there's no topic that's been more discussed, more hotly debated than the events in Ferguson, Missouri, and what they say about American policing and the way that police work with, get along with our communities that they serve, particularly African American and other communities of color. I've been speaking about it. I've been consulted about it, and I think there are some general points that are important to understand that a lot of times get overlooked. Number one, I would say, is people have to realize that when there is an incident, a use of force, something goes terribly wrong, as it did in Ferguson, for whoever's fault it may be, you have to remember that law enforcement in this country has an unfortunate history when it comes to race relations. And I'm not the first one to notice this, not by any means. On February 12th, the director of the FBI, James Comey, came out in a speech and said more or less the same thing. What kind of a history? Well, you go back into the 1830s, 40s, 50s, you'll see some of the first American police departments, particularly in the South, were slave patrols or units organized to get runaway slaves. And that is a well-documented part of the history of law enforcement. You go fast forward into the post-Civil War era, you have police officers enforcing segregation and Jim Crow laws. You talk about the Civil Rights era, you think of the lunch counter sit-ins and things like that. Those laws were enforced by police departments. And even if you can say with perfect justification that wasn't today's police department, that's not today's police officer, all true, but the people who face police in a demonstration or in some other hotly contested situation, that history to them is present. There's no incident that takes place on a blank slate. There's a history there, and woe unto those who forget it. The second point that I think gets missed a lot is that the police in this country have a very difficult job, and they have the right to use force in that job. Now, civilians, people like us, we could use force to defend ourselves if we were unjustly attacked. Self-defense. But we don't have the right to use force to go about our daily jobs or work. Police do. That's why a case in which it is considered whether the police did the right thing, that's why it's not a question of who did it or what was done. It's a question of whether the force was excessive. And that's a different question. The Supreme Court has made it very difficult to prove cases of excessive force by making the legal standard very open-ended. It comes from the case Graham versus Connor, and what the Supreme Court said there is that police may use force that is necessary, reasonably necessary under the circumstances. And you take a word like reasonable, and you know it can get different interpretations from different people. It is not a black, firm line that gets crossed at some point. It will depend a lot on the circumstances as the officer perceived them to be. And therefore, it is much harder, I think, than people appreciate to prove cases of excessive force against the police. So I've seen since the Ferguson incident a lot of exasperation. People don't understand why this or that police officer who did this or that thing has not been charged. And the job of the prosecutor is to prosecute cases that he or she can take to trial and where there is probable cause, and they feel that they can win and they can get the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. That is their function. And police cases are very difficult to win because of that legal standard. And on the federal side, they're even more difficult because there has to be proof of willful violation of the Constitution. That is among the highest legal standards that exist anywhere. So when the federal prosecutor in a jurisdiction say, like in Ferguson, looks at the evidence. They are looking at a very, very high standard of proof, and it's no surprise that in most cases the Department of Justice does not pursue those cases. They announce not enough for an indictment. The third thing I've heard a lot about since Ferguson is body cameras. Why don't we use more body cameras on police officers? And I want to say straight out, I'm a supporter of the use of body cameras in law enforcement. I've been looking at these devices and this technology since 2009, 2010, when they were in use in the UK and not very much over here. And now there's a kind of rush by cities to get into this, equip their police with body cameras. And I think generally it would be a good thing, but it's not a situation that you should go into just thinking it's going to cure everything that's wrong with policing. There are good reasons to be cautious. Number one is that what the camera does doesn't change the law. What the camera does doesn't change how a grand jury works or a decision a prosecutor makes. The camera is very good in most situations at creating a record, at determining to a good degree what the facts are, so that if you have a solid recording of an incident on a body camera, it should put a lot of the facts, maybe not all of them, but a lot of the facts beyond dispute. And so we won't have questions about what actually happened. A lot of people were dissatisfied with the result of the investigation of the death of Eric Garner in New York, a man who was in a chokehold. And they said, sometimes said to me, what difference would it make to have a camera? There was a cell phone camera, then we could all see what happened, and still the police officer wasn't charged. Well, the difference it makes was actually very great if you compare that case to Michael Brown and Ferguson. In Eric Garner's case, we knew what happened. In Michael Brown's case, there are people still today who question what happened, even after two very thorough investigations. You got people, some people say hands up, others say no. Some say he's going toward the police officer, others say no. Without the images, we're left wondering about a lot of things. But it doesn't change the fundamentals, the laws and so forth. The cameras will do a lot of great things. They will make a good record. They will enable officers to collect evidence. They will reduce complaints. We've seen that in the studies so far. They will reduce the uses of force, and sometimes dramatically. But they won't change the fundamentals of how policing works unless we are willing to take the lessons that they teach us and go forward with them and make the changes necessary. The last thing I would add about Ferguson is that the worst mistake that got made actually happened before the shooting of Michael Brown. And that is a complete failure to create a relationship between the police department and the people it served. Now, we know from the Department of Justice report on Ferguson that that department was highly dysfunctional. And in fact, the police department worked hand in glove with the court system simply to generate money and revenue for the justice system, to fund itself. They did all kinds of things. They violated the Constitution, and they piled fines on people and charges on people just to get money. And that's wrong. But beyond that, the police department in Ferguson had gone to no lengths at all to create a relationship between themselves and the people that they policed. They didn't know each other. They didn't know who presented a danger and who didn't. And the result was, when they had a catastrophe and there was a shooting of a young man, they had nowhere to go. They didn't know anything about him. They didn't know anything about other people involved. They didn't know who to call as community leaders to find out what people were saying and thinking. Their response was actually blind to their own community because they had not bothered. And if there's one thing I would tell police departments across the country, it is to make those moves now. Create those relationships now, before you have a catastrophe, before there's an emergency. Start the community meetings. Sit down with your critics. Talk to as many people as you can. Create opportunities for police officers to have one-on-one interaction with citizens, with young people. Have them walk beats, ride bicycles, get out of those cars, because that is what makes the difference.